Okay, thank you very much. This is odd. I heard whispers that there's 10 times more people online watching me as there are in the room, so this is quite exciting. So I'm going to talk to you about the challenges of community empowerment. I'm sort of responding to the Scottish Community Empowerment Renewal Bill consultation that the Scottish Government carried out last year, and published the consultation responses from earlier this year. So first of all, I just need to credit a couple of funders who have helped with the research that I'll be talking about just now. First of all, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland, and secondly, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and particularly their Connected Communities programme that were helped a great deal, particularly in the second piece of work I'll be talking about around social media. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking about the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill and the main proposals and the themes in that, and then problematise that a little bit by thinking about whose community are we empowering, what do we mean by community empowerment, and then talk about this in terms of the wider context in Scottish public policy and community planning, and then suggest that all communities are equal, but some are more equal than others, and conclude with some thoughts around that. So the proposals in the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation were very wide-ranging. In particular, they focused on community planning, which is the statutory process whereby public sector organisations come together in Scotland to work in partnership themselves and also work in partnership with communities. And there's a sense in the consultation that this was about renewing or reinvigorating community planning, that community planning offered a lot when it was introduced in 2003, but hadn't really delivered what it might have promised. There are also proposals to reform community councils, the lowest statutory body of the government in Scotland, including possibly giving them part of local authority budgets. There are proposals on extending the rural right to buy to urban communities, and my colleague Dr. Tom Moore will be talking about those in greater detail. There's a community right to challenge service providers, including the consultation, and also miscellaneous other provisions around allotments and processes of community engagement with public authorities. When we think about community empowerment, we do have a tendency to presume community isn't us. It can be used euphemistically to refer to deprived urban communities as captured in these photos here. Two fantastic photos of the Red Road flats in Glasgow here, which saw another one of the tower blocks came down over the weekend, and a community you'll hear a lot about later, Wester Hales down the bottom right-hand side there. So community isn't us, it's deprived urban communities, or alternatively, it's an idealistic notion of rural communities that are very cohesive and work very well together. So the first question, the first challenge I want to pose is how diverse are these communities? I can answer that in some part by work I carried out for the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland, looking at the diversity of deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. And with data from the Scottish Health Survey, we basically analyse what percentage of equality groups who are characterised by or share protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010 live in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. Key point in interpreting this data, if you can see the screen, is that if a group is evenly distributed in Scotland, then there should be 15% of it in the 15% most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. So if there's less than 15%, then that group is underrepresented. If there's more than 15%, then it's overrepresented. So just to pull out some key points here in this table, you'll notice that there is a high proportion of disabled and people with long-term ill health living in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland, almost 30%, so twice as many of that group than we might otherwise expect. In some ways, this is understandable. People who are disabled and have long-term ill health have fewer housing choices, so they're likely to have to access social housing, so will find themselves in this type of neighbourhood. More interesting ones are all white non-ethnicities. 22.9% of that group live in the most deprived 15% of neighbourhoods. Roman Catholics, again, that one's slightly more understandable given the long-term prejudice against Irish Catholics in Scotland. And one that is a bit more interesting is Muslims. 27.1% of that group live in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland, which you wouldn't expect to see given the nature of deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. If you look at patterns of spatial patterns of Muslims in, say, England. They tend to live in poor quality owner-occupied housing, not social rented housing as you find in deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. And finally, one I find particularly interesting, down at the very bottom, non-straight sexualities. Gay, lesbian, bisexual or other, 17% of that group are in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. So over-representation of that group and an under-representation of people who have declared themselves as heterosexual, 13.4% of that group. So overall, we can actually say these neighbourhoods aren't the demographically homogeneous white working class neighbourhoods that we might expect. They are very much more diverse than we might presume. To move on now, think about community planning, and that was really a big part of the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation focused on community planning. Many reviews of community planning, including the Christie Commission, have often found it wanting in terms of community partnership. Christie states, for the most part, the process of community planning has focused on the relationships between organisations rather than with communities. And this is similar to experience with similar strategic partnerships in England, the former local strategic partnerships. In the consultation on the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, the Scottish Government also recognised the weaknesses in community planning. But overall, its Community Empowerment Bill is seen as a way to reinvigorate community planning. And the ongoing development of community planning is seen as a way to get the sort of joint working with communities that's needed to co-produce outcomes to deliver change in Scotland's communities. But also, there was a very positive note in the consultation document. There is an explicit recognition of the diversity and difference and the challenges of this in community empowerment. It stated, it will be important to ensure that community empowerment takes account of diverse communities and reaches both more marginalised individuals within communities and more marginalised communities within society. But I now want to challenge and ask, how realistic is this? A piece of work I carried out with Annette Hastings at the University of Glasgow for the Arts and Humanities Research Council Connected Communities programme. We reviewed the literature across the public services from the US, UK and Scandinavia from the 1980s to the present day to understand the impact of middle-class community activism on the delivery of public services. And through this, we identified 4 causal theories by which middle-class community activism has an impact on public services. I'll just quickly run through these for you. First of all, I'll stand as the parish council chair or community council chair. That is that across the literature, the middle classes are more likely to be members of groups, but most importantly, they're more likely to be members of groups that matter. They join groups that policymakers listen to, like community councils, parent-teacher associations, or school governing boards. Secondly, I'll write to my council and complain. That's that the middle classes complain, and they complain more. And even if you get so wealthy that you no longer send your kids to state schools, you still complain even more about services, but you complain about other services. And what's interesting in that as well is we found that there's a positive feedback loop. The middle classes complain about the service provider responds, and the middle classes think, oh, I'll do that again because it worked last time. And so there's a positive reinforcing cycle there. The third causal theory is I'll just phone our doctor. This is the fact that middle-class professionals are engaging with middle-class professionals when they access public services. So therefore, they're talking this right language. They have an alignment of cultural capital with service providers that enables them to get more out of the public service they're accessing. And finally, I'll vote for them. This is just that we found that generally across public services, there is a predisposition in policy to deliver policy that benefits the middle classes. I really would recommend you read the analysis of the consultation responses for the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. It's a fantastic document, and it's particularly, I find it very interesting because it's how reflexive Scotland can be about what community means and what community empowerment means. It's a really wonderful document to read. And includes reflexivity like this quote from NHS Lothian. And they stated quite clearly regarding the proposals to empower community councils. Many equality groups and individuals, however, feel disassociated and disenfranchised from community councils. They have expressed that they are often cliques who do not represent nor discuss anything of relevance to them, and only those with the loudest voices are acted upon. This is clearly NHS Lothian recognising that first causal mechanism of middle classes having a say in public services that I referred to a moment ago. But to move on to think about the third causal mechanism and the alignment of community of cultural capital among service providers and the middle classes, there is a presumption within the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill that community empowerment will be through community planning and will be state initiated and strategic. It will be on the state's terms. The government will, local government will engage with you to get what local government wants. Now, I have two issues with that, deriving from my research on the middle classes. Firstly, it returns to a previous problem with many of the social inclusion agendas that have dominated policy in Scotland and the rest of the UK, that the community you're engaging with are somehow deficient and they need support to engage with you, and in doing so, they will be improve themselves. But more importantly, and from my middle classes research, it ignores community empowerment as instrumental and citizen initiated. The second causal mechanism, those emails and letters of complaint. And as I stated before, evidence from the US shows that as your income grows, you complain more about public services, even if you don't need to access those public services. And within documents like the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation and broader statements on community empowerment from all governments of all types, there is a silence towards this type of behaviour and its possible effects on public service delivery. And this now moves us on to the fourth causal mechanism and the general predisposition we discovered to normalising the problems of affluent or middle class people and making the problems of deprived neighbourhoods somehow problematic and the subject of community empowerment initiatives. That normalisation of the problems of the affluent communities means I feel community empowerment will not deliver the sort of deep deliberation required for the sort of fair and inclusive outcomes to be delivered in society. Sorry, I've gone right back to the very end of the presentations. Sorry about that. I was doing so well. So for the later presenters, watch our ends very close to next. In particular, what I feel is needed is deep deliberation about what I term the strategy of equality, and particularly the strategy of spatial equality. What do I mean by the strategy of equality? Well, basically, this is the question about, well, do we want areas to get the same treatment from public services? Do we want areas to arrive at the same outcomes, so they get different services, but they start from a different place, but they end at the same place? Or even more controversially, do areas only ever get the services that they can afford to pay for? Now, if you look down at the proposals in England contained in the Localism Act and the Localism consultation bill before that, they explicitly aimed to create spatial inequality. So they stated, variation will reflect the conscious choices made by local people. And our evidence suggests that these local people are more likely to be the most affluent and therefore the most vocal in any area. This version of localism being implemented in England is very much about a winner-takes-all culture. As stated just a moment ago, the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation responses show amazing reflexivity. And among the analysis of the bit about community councils, there are many quotes from community councils saying, yes, yes, I want a budget, I want more power, yeah, yeah. But there's this one wonderful quote from Arnprior Community Council near Stirling about this question about should community councils have budgets. And they stated very clearly, under no circumstance should any management of spending be transferred to local area groups. Control of spending at local council and national level is essential to ensure fair and equitable distribution of spending for the entire population of Scotland. rather than for the benefit of individual community groups. So we're seeing those two different versions of thinking about what does devolving budgets mean, the English version and this version from this tiny little community council in Stirling, very different ideas of what the strategy of equality might be. That's a very big debate to have to get some sort of consensus between those two positions. I question whether we can realistically create spaces for that sort of deliberation when we are creating community empowerment. In particular, our research on middle-class communities suggests that marginalised individuals and communities are effectively in a king-canute position. They're fighting for resources, but they're facing an overwhelming tide of activism from much more able groups. And therefore, these spaces of deliberation are always going to be unequal. They're going to come to them with unequal resources and from an unequal starting point. And this, for me, raises questions about the role of representative democracy and political leadership in the delivery of services, and the role of leadership in making difficult decisions. So, for example, in my own research, I watched a police officer at a neighbourhood partnership meeting turn around to a woman from an affluent neighbourhood saying, "I want more police patrols in my allotment because we're getting our tools stolen." And the police officer had to very, very bravely stand up and say, "No, we don't have enough resources to do that because we have to send policemen down to this local deprived neighbourhood every night just to keep the peace. Get insurance," was that police officer's response to that woman. And that takes a lot of bravery and a lot of leadership for somebody in a public setting to say those sorts of things. Also, in the era of austerity we find ourselves in, with issues like the bedroom tax and household incomes falling, comes back to me to the question from the international development literature of you can't eat community engagement. So why should we expect deprived neighbourhoods to engage with policymakers when they're struggling just to make ends meet, when just getting the dinner on the table is all they're really interested in? Moving on to think about the role of the voluntary sector in this. I think the voluntary sector, and I think Tom and Caroline will talk more about this in their presentations, do have a role in delivering community empowerment in a very positive way and can help overcome some of the negativity that I've sort of highlighted so far. So first of all, they clearly have a role in community development, in helping communities become active and also critical of service providers and other organisations. And in doing so, become, as well as empowering communities to do it themselves, become advocates for groups across society, for example, equalities groups, or also spatial communities. They also have an important role as anchor organisations within neighbourhoods, particularly when they have capital ownership and assets. And with that, I will now hand on to Tom, because that's a perfectly seamless integration.